Hola a todos, es para la escuela un honor dar la bienvenida a Thom Mayne, Morphosis, a nuestro centro. It's for me a special pleasure last year visiting different universities of the United States, going to Cornell, going to Cooper Union. You were always having a building of Thom Mayne. So now the general landscape or the general university landscape is being marked by him. And having him at the school, I have to thank Luis Fernandez Galeano and his team for giving us this opportunity. His generosity not only for a critical session, but also for this session, this lecture to all the school. Thom, welcome. Thank you for being here. I pass the word to Begoña.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm just going to introduce a few words for Thom. Thom, it's Angelino's architect. There's no root for Los Angeles, but it's a classical Angelino professor. He founded his firm Morphosis in 1962, and he also founded University SCIARC. He thought architecture should be taught in a different way from where he studied. So now he's going to show us his work from urban point of view. And we just had a discussion. It was really interesting and very intense. So we will learn from your images, Thom. Thank you very much.
Is it on? Good? Thank you, Bego. Do I have some of the people that I just was speaking to in the room? Are you here? No? Yes, okay. Because I didn't quite realize the project I was going to critique, and this is going to be much more about architecture than urban design, although it's going to end, and I'll make it very specific to our conversation we had in the critique. A pleasure to be here. It's a between lecture work. Moving from Vigo, I'm going to be in my office in New York and very quickly have dinner with my son in New York at 8 o'clock tonight, and this is going to be the in-between kind of conversation. I put together kind of a very particular lecture for this that's for you students, and that I've been realizing that with larger commissions and the type of work I'm doing today, that it seems insignificant to show just current work without an understanding of the arrival of a process of getting there. And that I put together something that hopefully is useful to you, in that it has more to do with what you're going to be doing as you walk out the door and start your own individual practice. And the kind of thinking maybe that takes place, but it'll be something that explains very particularly the arrival of very particular conceptual strategies, and it's going to have to do with the connectedness of you as a professional that starts primarily or very possibly with much more private, aesthetic, conceptual, subjective terms of architecture and moves towards much more substantial issues that are economic, political, cultural, infrastructural, urbanistic, etc., that come with responsibilities as the increased scale takes place and the increased complexity of the work. All right, and I'm going to move very quickly. I've thought from really pretty much the beginning, I've questioned being able to explain architecture in any formal sense, and at this point in my life, I'm even more committed to that you cannot really explain the work, which is highly personal and which is connected to a series of events that are not necessarily explainable, and I think it's not important. What I'm going to talk about are the terms of the work and the issues that are occupying the studio at that particular time, and they're going to definitely move from the private to the more public, or the more one that connects to a system of thinking which has to do with the broader studio and is much more interdisciplinary than the beginning. You start your thinking out of school, and it's somewhat private, and I'm looking for a voice and a signature, and it's somewhat mysterious, and it's taking place somewhat intuitively, the way if you were a musician or if you're a painter in any different art forms, that you're locating your own instinctual stuff that's separate from the more discursive and the stuff that comes out of your university training, et cetera. And if anything, you're challenging or kind of reworking that, because the university is a broader. Yeah, that's better. I like when you go black. It's always weird to be talking to blackness. And you're locating yourself in formal terms, and there's definitely things that are going to show up later in your life that you're not aware of, and in this case, notions of disconnectedness and of fragmentation, which were basically much more part of my personal life, and that had to do with my own condition as a young man forward. And you're exploring something, and you're not even quite clear the nature of that exploration. It's quite intuitive. But what you are clear of, and you were influenced by certain people, and one of them for me was James Sterling. And I remember when I was looking at his drawings, I was just flabbergasted at the number of drawings he made, and how drawing was really a method of thinking. And it became clear to me that this was a method of thinking, and I thought visually, and it was quite separate from normative discourse. And the drawing became a preoccupation of a way of seeing the world, and the mediums were changing. And well, there was definite all kinds of influences at the time of being in Los Angeles and connections with the art scene and the kind of questions being asked in that visual world. And it also was clear that I was in a time where you dealt with multiple mediums, and I was no longer interested in any kind of singularity, that I could work across many boundaries, and it'd be a Bruce Nauman, or you could name the various characters that were part of that. And then with that, well, there's other kind of simpler things. I'm in my late 20s, and there's no work. And I'm teaching, and I'm doing a little bit of stuff to make a living, and this is my output. This is the work I'm doing. And in the 70s and in the early 80s, there was actually a little different environment in the US than there is now, and that I was being shown in galleries, and I could actually use this. It was accepted that as an architect, you could work conceptually. And the output is that. And again, I'm looking at kind of multiple mediums, and the work is progressing, or the idea is progressing, and it's going to be continuing to work with formal ideas which have to do with new notions of coherency. That I'm fascinated in the way architects, essentially, in the simplest way, we order things. We concretize the world. We take idea structures, we take notions that are social, cultural, political, etc., and we concretize them into form, right? And we use inert matter. We use basically mineral material. And with that, I was interested in the vibrancy, the aliveness, the awakeness of that material, right? And communicating that. And I'm of a generation that broke from the modern tradition. And in the 60s, late 60s, when I was in school, there was a complete openness to what education was, what architecture was, and I left with questions versus solutions, right? And then the influences were vast, and they weren't coherent, or they weren't connected. So Rossi and Sterling and Archigram, and I could rattle on, the Tendenza, all of them just were seeping in, and there was no connectivity. It was up to you to figure out the nature of these kind of issues. And they were very, very fundamental, the most essential notions of what architecture is, having to do with even its stasis, its permanence, et cetera, right? And of course, with that came the obvious influences of that period of time, which started with political resistance and an explosion in the arts, because I was inundated in film, and it was the Truffaut and Godards, and it was that era of experimentation. And there was, and of course, in the world of music and the world of culture that was taking place at that period of time, without any question, had influences, maybe even more so than the architectural. And the drawings continued, and then, well, it started in the late 80s. The computer shows up, and I'm drawing, but I'm trying to draw like I draw, and I'm kind of challenging the rules of the highly systematized notion of the digital, which will be later the conversation. And it's going to quite radically change kind of how we think about architecture, but it's going to take a decade to figure that out. And then parallel to this, I entered architecture actually in a very kind of simple way. As a young man, I kind of made stuff. And I was not an academic kind of kid, and I came out of an academic family, but I wanted to kind of make things, and I did the German and the physics and the biology because I had to do that because my parents would insist on it, and I'm going to college and all that. But what I really was fascinated with was the mechanics, and that quickly became part of our early work, and then with the conceptual stuff that came out through the drawings and the models, et cetera, we're making things. And we're very, very much involved, and it started with very small scale things and objects. And we're investing time in various material processes, right? And understanding that a huge amount, the capability of creativity comes out of that process very different than the conceptual or intellectual process, right? And that it became clear at this time that there was a connection between these two things. They both kind of operated together. And out of that came out an interest in intensifications of the work, because then the first work shows up and it's like normative, it's residential and little cafes, and had no interest whatsoever in program, had no interest in the relationship of those things. We're interested in locating architecture. And how does one claim an autonomy for architecture? And then in this time, we were totally committed to architecture as an autonomous act. And we wore it as a badge outside of normative behavior, right? And couldn't do that today. That's not a model that you guys can use. It could happen in the 70s and 80s. And, but this led to kind of intensifications of projects. And so we're working on a carcinogenic center, and this one piece became a part of a children's play area. And it became kind of a fascination where we could kind of use the interests we had at the time and manifest those in the project. And this became kind of continuous. And it's going to start leading us into something else, and that we're, at this time, without knowing it, we're starting to shift a notion of part whole in the most basic way, Palladio. And the relationship between part, fragment, connection, disconnection, the way one organizes an idea having to do with certain hierarchies, repetition, et cetera, were being challenged, but the focus was still more on the degree of intensification within the work. And then as again, this little house that became kind of a beginning model that was going to move us more into an urbanistic direction, we're making things, and it's starting to become clear that we can organize these different systems. And I became more and more fascinated by an article, an idea that Smithson was an initiator of in the middle 40s, having to do with multiple systems and the autonomy of multiple systems making up something. So the thing you're making isn't made out of a single system, it's made out of multiple systems, and it's getting clearer as we're producing these first little residential projects. And it's starting to lead us into another idea organizationally, that there isn't a single a dominant system. There's a series of interconnected things taking place, and it's more and more about interconnection. And then with that, certain things happen that just are absolutely accidental and circumstantial. A fragment of the model of the project in front of us, and we're building one of these areas that we're kind of focusing on, and then with that, as we look at the photograph, we realize that the fragment is more interesting than the total, and we're just looking at something going, how is it possible to build something that's completely unfinished, that it now alludes to only future, right? The thing in front of it, right? And it's actually quite a hard thing to construct, at least it is for me mentally, but it requires operational strategies that you understand is the method of working that achieves that. And at this time now, the people that I'm connected to or that are influenced to me would be the Bernard Schumys and the Peter Eismans and people that are using operational methodologies. And I'm getting more and more interested in, especially in my academic work, of a challenging a priori design, thinking, drawing, right, which uses the past, uses precedent, right, and using operational strategies that take you someplace that you have no notion of where it's going, right? It's challenging anything a priori. And it became kind of a fixation in that the only things I was interested in, the things that I didn't know where they were going, right? And it became, at that point, an absolute kind of a continuum. And then immediately after that, the development of the 6th Street House, where we're now organizing something, and it's through an association of a series of elements. In this case, 10 pieces of discarded technology, of dead tech. And then at the same time, breaking this notion of a singularity where every elevation is now a response to its urban condition. And it's an experiment with kind of rethinking the nature of, again, coherency. And then in the resolve of this residence in Santa Barbara, a development of now a language that's made up of these various systems, all left unfinished, all fragments of some total thing. And you're looking at something that more and more is made up of relationships. And at this point, it's getting clearer and clearer that we're not any longer interested in the object, we're interested in the relationship of objects, right? And the focus is getting clearer and clearer. And then with that, we're now starting to get more and more involved with the relationship of sight and earth, and we're digging. And again, I'm absorbing incredible show at Leo Castelli, can't remember when, and I became aware of Pichler. And then right after that, I met Raymond Abraham, and I got interested in digging, and the whole notion of ground became kind of a fixation, and it became kind of, again, kind of an expanded kind of interest of this. And then we're working on competitions, and we got invited for the American Gedenkbibliothek in Berlin, and this notion of highly specific architecture that's coming from multiple systems that makes up a combinatory language, although I didn't use those terms at that time, is becoming absolutely part of an urban strategy, and probably is much more relevant urbanistically than it is architecturally, you might argue. And so we have something here where we can identify historic elements and use those as grounding elements, and we can invent certain things, and it's going to be a combination of conserving and expanding found urban elements and provoking those. And then with that, I guess, a clarity of not taking any singular position of being conservative or provoking, that those things happen simultaneously. We didn't discuss that in the urban work, but it absolutely could have been a conversation today, that as you look at the site, aspects of that are in fact reinforcing or dealing directly with found information, and other things are absolutely provoking that. And they can operate on a scale. And if we looked at various projects, some of them could much more been in the provocation area, and much more, other ones could have been much more in the conservation kind of territory. And again, the competitions are now practice runs for future work, right? I'm in my late 30s, and we're doing smaller scale work. And this is we won a competition for a theater that didn't get built. And now any number of things are taking place between organizational ideas and the ground and the site is becoming more and more prominent as the relationship, the site takes place. And then this one was monumental for us, another competition for the Expo in Vienna. And the pieces on the upper left, we're now identifying ground as active material, and we're challenging the most basic idea of figure ground. And that ground is now programmatic. And this changes forever. I'm still working on that problem, right? And that in modern programs, huge amount of material can now be found in ground. Infrastructure, theater complexes, commercial complexes, we go on. And it would have been really, again, if we had continued the conversation with you guys today in the urban, it would have definitely been, it would be the next stage of the conversation maybe. We would have discussed that in looking at really, really different kind of potentialities of the integration between landscape and site and building. Because as I said today, one of the opportunities that's in front of us is something that's much more hybridized. Because in this project, half of the program would be ground related and half within a more traditional typological. And we're now discussing typology and morphology. There's a kind of conversation take place. And then in our project in Chiba, this is starting to take place as we're trying to find an architecture which is very much about site and starts with the notion of site and landscape. And this could be a dialogue between landscape and building. And then right after that, what have I got here? Ooh, we shouldn't have shown up. We're doing a house, and a lot of these same ideas are taking place. Okay, we're starting work now. And again, I've put this together for you. I'm working a couple decade and a half, and we're getting our first substantial work. And I'm 47 or 48 years old, and it's a school, and we had kind of an unusual kind of client that allowed us to explore. And the work now clearly is shifting from an interest, and our notion of autonomy is being challenged, and the notion of the fixation on the more conceptual, formal kind of work is now getting challenged to some degree, and it's clearly that we're now involved in architecture as a social act, and we're involved in the relationship of architecture as it participates in the educational act, and we're producing something that we want to kind of expand curiosity, expand to a student the notion of the various kind of potential of how architecture can service them. And then with that is the beginning of the digital kind of world. And the little piece at the top is the first kind of conceptual sketch. And it's, again, going to be an augmented landscape. And out of that is going to come to this. And then right after that, we won a competition in Austria for the Hoopa Bank. And we're in this middle territory now between the older processes of drawing in a manual sense and the digital world. And it's becoming clear with these drawings to me that drawing is now highly kind of limited, and that the thinking process takes place with complex relational material that the digital world allows us to do. And it operates three-dimensionally. And at this point, we're probably realizing that the planimetric is pretty much over as a primary process of developing architecture, that we're now moving into something three-dimensional. And as we're looking at sections, huge numbers of drawings that are now mechanical, but what's taking place is there are less and less sections in the conventional sense. They're CAT scans, and they're a way of observing a project and understanding it organizationally within certain terms. And out of it came this. And then with this, working in Austria, we were allowed a certain freedom that doesn't happen in the US, that allowed us to explore ideas, and the whole notion of the kind of radical differentiation, which I haven't touched yet, that came very early on, that differentiation is the kind of a singular kind of idea that I'm interested in and kind of challenging, and looking for kind of radical diversity within a single project, right? And it's still a preoccupation. And then right after that, for the same client in Urbano, a project that's dealing with landscape, building, infrastructure, has a more kind of a singular idea. And then the digital now is having kind of a huge effect on us in that we're producing things three-dimensionally that have different notions of association and arguments, and they're dynamic. And the section you're looking at, again, is a CAT scan, and I'm cutting 100 sections through this and observing kind of the nature of the product we're developing. And then what happened is that, which was enormous, is that you could crawl in your drawing, or what do you want to call this virtual space, and you could connect concept and perception, right? And again, that became enormous, that we can actually experience the notion, the conceptual ideas, the broader kind of intellectual thinking we can now experience spatially. And then what's going to happen, a competition for Nara that we lost to Isesaki, and we're producing forms that we can't even produce mechanically. And 4 years later, we're working on a competition, and we can now, in minutes, kind of operate within complex geometries. And what's taking place now, which all of you kind of entered, interesting today, seems like there's a very different kind of direction here architecturally than there is in the US. And the work I saw was still Cartesian and orthogonal, et cetera. And for me, this just opened up possibilities. I have no particular, it's not about a value judgment. It's just there, right? I don't have to agree or disagree with it, right? It's just now how I can work. And I can now kind of operate and move very quickly, and I can look at it if I want to sectionally. In a traditional way, I can look at it as a model. I can put it on a site, et cetera, and I can model it, and it's taking place through the digital world between 8 at night and 8 in the morning. And I'm also moving at the speed of light, right? And again, what you're going to face is larger and larger scale projects with less and less time. And one of the things that are going to be absolutely essential to architects today is dealing with the speed that the world operates in a commercial sense, right? And you're going to have to understand that because you're dealing with larger and larger scale projects with least resources. The first stuff I showed you, I'm spending a year on a residence, and we're now spending that amount of time on projects that are in the million square feet, and there's no choice. It's the nature of the marketplace, right? And there's a huge kind of shift going on now. And again, we can look at our work that's in incredibly comprehensive terms. That what's taking place in the digital world that again is affecting your work right now, that early schematic, pre-schematic work is loaded with information. You can discuss it in tectonic terms, structurally, mechanically, functionally, et cetera, et cetera. And the projects, as they get more and more complex, you're looking at a model for a competition that REM won in Taiwan, that's 8 weeks, right? And it's the necessity of how we work today. And then we're in Korea, and we're going to be dealing in skins, and that's going to become another preoccupation. And we're using Jim Dine and a piece of clothing, and it's one of the last projects I'll show you. And again, we're capable now of kind of looking at things very quickly, organizing them in very complex terms. Okay, the work begins now, you might say. That's the preliminary work, and establishes a lot of the terms of which I'm going to be interested in. And we're going to start in Los Angeles with kind of our first large-scale project, and it's going to have very much to do with the public. It's going to have to do with the iconography of Los Angeles as the city of film, and it's going to continue our interest in the eccentric, I'm searching for elements of design that come out of chance and circumstance, and that are idiosyncratic versus systematic. And we're looking at making these spaces very much specific to their place. Los Angeles is not a place of public space, and so we activated this space with its own architecture, sans the human character. And it's going to be very much about the surface, is very much about a surface that's a receiver of film and becomes part of the kind of the focus of the project. And then in San Francisco, we're taking the performative aspects. The skin you just last saw is moving, and it's producing a highly efficient building. And what's happening now, again, is we're moving further and further kind of away from a preoccupation of the formal and getting more and more involved in performance and the demands of buildings as they become an increase in scale. This is the headquarters for the federal government, and it's the first tall building that has no air conditioning in the United States. And it's performance driven. And again, it's based on a main public space. And we were very connected to the formation of the program. And it's getting very clear to us now that the work becomes more and more strategic. That when one takes responsibility and pushes the program in the whole direction of the project prior to formalizing it or to concretizing it within form. And in this case, it's going to have to do with a very substantial shift in the workforce, which is all now based on transparency and interconnection and dialogue, and is being challenged by the digital world again, where workspaces are essentially any place equals workspace. And there's a complete challenge of the singularity of work versus leisure versus recreation, et cetera. And the architecture, or this notion of the combinatory, these multiple systems, is now not even part of the conversation. It's the private conversation within the studio. It has nothing to do with the client. And the focus is on multiple levels of performance. And in this case, one of the major kind of ideas was the element of the icon of the entry space and the importance of the space in terms of representing the U.S. government, et cetera. And then the performance became hugely kind of, in terms of environment, important to the building. And the north face is guiding in sun. And we can now talk about this in terms of its relationship to total energy. And we can discuss with our client that one of these buildings totally powers 600 houses. And again, I would have said in today's jury, that we didn't get to it. One of the conversations would have been looking at your work in terms of its broader consequences and being responsible for those consequences as they have larger, as their magnitude increases, right? And they have more and more importance to city making. And then in Eugene, we have this completely different notion. We're building a courthouse, and it's about a symbol. And we're going to work literally dozens of schemes working with the Chief Justice to come to grips with an acceptable notion of the history of the courthouse. And it's going to start with kind of the surface and kind of the expression of this building that was going to be the part of the documentation of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which is going to turn into this. And it's going to be about a fluid, open-ended, clearly something that represents an idea that'd be very didactic of the openness of the Constitution, of the nature of our system of law. And it's going to lead you into a courthouse. And the courthouse is going to be filled with the history of 250 years of the traditional courthouse, the one-room courthouse, and this would be a 1-hour lecture. Literally, the bench that you sit on and the nature of that would be part of that. And once you're in the courthouse, it uncodes the notion of the building. You understand that the form you're looking at is a collective tissue of the courtroom itself. And in the States, the single courtroom, the single one courthouse was kind of the history. And then there's times when you get a very kind of odd client, Cooper Union, which is completely in line with the formal, and they were interested in the idiosyncratic. They were interested in kind of something that was asystematic and something that conveyed the intellectual creative capital of the institution. And that one which is about the connectivity of engineering, art, and architecture, which is their claim. And so the beginning notion was locating the project. And again, this would be continuing our conversation today, that your first kind of work at a project is actually locating the aspect of the work that's the most important, that you have a constituency for, right? That you're in alignment with. And it started with the central space. And It's going to be a vertical 11-story piazza, and it's about connectivity, and it's about the advancement of discourse and conversation, which is the essence of the school. And it's going to be the thing that's memorable about this particular institution as you're looking up in that space and you're crossing, right, as you move through the space. And all of it is going to be using movement and traditional architectural elements as part of a social connective tissue. And today, what's going on in education, which is really fascinating, which somehow seems to be all located at Stanford D School, is the social pedagogy. We understand education much more within broad social terms. And there's a huge shift, again, I can't speak for this place or for Spain, but a reshifting of hierarchies and relationship between professor-student and the notion of how one even studies, et cetera, which is affecting education. And then again, it's filled with unique kind of spaces. And then once in a while, you get kind of odd kind of opportunities. In our Museum of Science and Nature in Dallas, we've been engaged now in kind of developing site. And now we have kind of this incredible opportunity where reconstructing site becomes the major part of the project and services the project in terms of its exhibit spaces, in terms of its site next to a freeway. And the beginning of the project starts with constructing site. And again, today, for those of you that we talked to, we didn't have that conversation, but we could have discussed, it'd be the next phase, that you start with not building, you're reconstructing site. And you understand that it's not building, you don't accept the notion of building land, right? You start with the notion that you have the responsibility that starts with the reshaping of the site itself, and it becomes maybe one of the kind of prominent kind of ideas. So the first phase is this, and we have certain elements that are going to end up on the site and other elements in the building. And then the second phase is going to continue this. And this is also interesting. Client wouldn't buy this, too advanced for them. They wanted a more traditional building. So the first one, the cube ends up as part of that. And now they've decided that they get it, they understand it, and we're expanding it. And the more dominant piece will be now the much more kind of aggressive kind of site piece, which also explores a much more kind of progressive idea of kind of the form of the building. And so here we are looking at the first kind of diagrams of the site itself, and it's going to replicate the site of a very new city, and we're using found materials that were on that site prior to urbanization. And now it's going to go through various iterations, and it's going to go back and forth between kind of quick kind of diagramming and much more precise notions that come out of the digital. And again, it's going to develop three-dimensionally from the very beginning, because we're looking at this now within months, right? And it's integrated, and it's in technical terms. And then the whole thing is going to be a dialogue between site information and building. And in a way, we built the largest exhibit, being a nature museum, kind of the conventional entry point. The vertical movement, which leaves the building, which I'll talk about in a minute. The vertical space connecting what are essentially black boxes for the museum. The entry sequence. We're in a site very separate from the city, and we're committed to making this an urban event. And as you move up, you're moving up the escalator you saw, and the escalator is leaving the building, right? It's moving towards the city purposely, right? And when you arrive at the top, you're engaged in the city again. And you've made the connection and mentally to the city. And then, again, I think what's changing is that a lot of you are very possibly going to get engaged in very particular technical aspects of work. And because of the increase of information, we very early on take responsibility for things. And so we're making a facade, and we had a very, very tight budget. And we're in a city that makes concrete. And so from the beginning, we knew we had kind of opportunities. And we're inventing a facade and we're at the site prototyping it, and the woman in blue is from the studio, and we're engaged in very, very particular terms, the method of the production of the panel and its construction. And because of that, we're producing something under very, very taut economic terms. And we're also kind of experimenting and pushing the technology with the subcontractor. And out of that, this is an ad in Architectural Record, and 6 months before the building is open, they're selling our product. And it's our product, right? And it opened up yet another kind of division in the office. And we now have a group that it basically, it's X-Tech. And we're constructing products that represent a contemporary kind of approach to the problem. And then again in Los Angeles with the Emerson College from Boston, working reiteratively, make something, critique it, remake it, et cetera, and then again, out of that comes the plan section, elevation, et cetera. And a school that's in Boston that's coming to LA, so we're producing something that's very, very much something about a Los Angeles kind of dynamicism. It's housing on the edges, academic and administration in the middle. And highly urbanistic. Perfect site, Sunset Boulevard, Hollywood sign, couldn't have been a more kind of ideal site. And all of it exploring something that's highly urban, and again, very much about public discourse. And we're bringing aspects of Boston, which would be the antithetical city to Los Angeles, and it's about spaces between, found spaces, interstitial spaces, compressed spaces. And again, as the language changes, and maybe someone will tell me before I leave, because again, the work I saw seemed to be more or less Cartesian. As you push the opportunity for language, which includes something as simple as a double curve, you find more and more you have to take responsibility for the making of that. And it goes back to the first slide I showed you, that if we design something, we're responsible for making it. Yeah? And so again, we're looking at it in model, and we're systematizing it, and we're making complex things where the shapes are highly differentiated, and we're in the shop again with our people inventing the method of making this thing and making it within contemporary terms, in terms of budget. And it's moving architecture more the way we make a Boeing airplane and versus a building. And it's going to continue in our work that allows us to make this. And then we look at a skin, and again, it's going to pursue something highly differentiated versus singular. And we're going to take responsibility, and we're literally making and framing every part, and it's coming out of our studio, and we're giving them a roadmap of construction. So we've given them the elements here, and literally take responsibility for the production sequence that gets us this. Okay, and then I got 2 more projects. This is going to summarize, in a way, a lot of the work I showed you. It's a research center in Seoul, Korea, and it's going to be very much about a dynamic sectional quality that you're looking at the bottom of the screen. And it's going to summarize a notion towards skin and performance, and it's going to be, it's in the plan, there's the upper part is all research. 90% of the building is the research center, and the very front part is meeting spaces and social spaces, and it's going to be a very, very straightforward kind of diagram of that starts the building. And it's facing a park, and it has this kind of incredible site, and kind of the entry space, and it's seen from above. And again, it's going to represent the differentiation of the city. It's not a single building. We're looking at something. And as you enter the building, you enter this connected space. And you enter something very representation of the nature of the larger organization and what they represent and it's the scale of Notre Dame. And then, again, looking for specificity of the work, this is a group that produces very high technology fabric. The airbag on your car probably comes from them. We're using their material and reinventing it in terms of an internal skin, and these are 6 of their different fabrics. So we're literally locating kind of the nature of the product of this group, and it's basically chemistry in terms of the major space, and retranslating it in architectural terms. And again, all of this is going to come from a very different notion towards commerce today, which has to do with transparency and it has to do with interconnectedness and dialogue between staff. And as you move across this space, it's where all the social activities are, and it's where all the meeting spaces are. And then the second part of the project, the skin, is a continuation of our work, but it's pushing it in terms of materialization. And it happens to be this company produces high-tech fabrics. They make fashion, and they have construction business. So we're literally going back to the Korean building, and we understand that the skin is a second kind of outerwear, and we're using their notion of fabric, and we're translated that as it makes, it gives us an idea of our own kind of new skin that's going to be a performance skin environmentally. It takes out 50% of the light, and we're going through those studies, and it's going to get us this. We're prototyping it in our own studio, and then when it arrives to Korea, the second prototypes are being made full scale. And then they're making a full-scale prototype on the building that gets us this. And then from the inside, you understand the scale. We're now kind of radically increasing, and it's GFRP. It's state-of-the-art, a carbon fiber-like, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that's becoming kind of part of the activity of the studio. And then finally, our Paris project, which is going to use the idiosyncratic ideas. The work comes with as little a priori notion as possible, and that it deals with the found information, is really servicing us. And we won the competition because we were one of the only firms that understood the difficulty and the specificity of the site. And that was really a non-site that gave us this. And again, it's not a single building, it's accumulation. It's a series of buildings that make up an urban construct. And as you see it, it's no longer extruded, right? It's something that demonstrates itself in very different form based on how you see it in the city. And then finally, and that's going to lead to a tower that we're building right now, and it's going to be highly differentiated. Every floor is different as you move up. And you're going to move, you're going to move across, we took the core and separated it from the building. So you're walking across 17 meters on a bridge, which you're going to see in a minute. And the 2 entries, commercial, and there it is under construction. And as you walk across the core, you're connected to the city on the 70th floor, right? And you're looking at the city as you're moving from movement into the space, and then the space has no core. You get these huge empty floor plates that give you 360-degree views. There you go. How are we on time? We okay? It's funny, I'm on a kind of a crazy trip. I'm worrying. I'm getting tired. But in Milan, it's going to move urban. And it's going to be a campus. And we won the project because we didn't build singular buildings. We understood it in terms of a campus, and we built public space. And the buildings, and then with that, we use this idea of land. This is for Eni, largest oil conglomerate in Italy. And we understood that oil is a biological in stratas of geology. And we use that idea to kind of establish the building. That the building itself is seen in geological terms, and it was the beginning idea, right? As we again started from kind of cuts of the earth, and then out of that came kind of a diagram and the stratification that led to a facade. The campus itself. under construction 3 years from now. Okay, last project. But a break. I'm going back to drawings. I wish the woman we talked to yesterday was here, because this is what I would have shown her. The interview we did yesterday that she didn't get. We had an interesting interview. I was interviewed for something, and we were trying to connect what you're doing conceptually, which operates under more complex terms, and how architects service a society, and we were struggling. And she was putting us, which a lot of the world is going to do to you. You're either in a conceptual world and live in that conceptual world, and you should be a jazz musician or something, right? Or a poet, right? Or you live in the real world, and I'm going, no. Architecture is only architecture. It is unique as an art form. Film maybe it gets close. It does this, right? And it operates within a private territory that maybe 12 people understand. And it's Finnegan's Wake. It doesn't matter. 12 years to write it, 12 people understand it. Who cares, right? Or it operates in a broader sense that it becomes something that one has to understand and move forward if you're a writer with choice. And so we're 3 or 4 years ago, I'm realizing that my pragmatic world is getting more and more dominant, and I'm missing both the privacy of my own work that comes through drawings and that operates privately, and that operates without the huge contingencies and the vicissitudes of the world that burdens you, finally, right? And again, that'd be very, very much a conversation we were having, although in the urban work, we'll end to that. And I'm drawing again, but I'm drawing three-dimensionally, and I'm using the digital world, and I'm interested in chance behavior, and willfulness and chance, you could say, is one of the 20th century projects, starting with Duchamp. And it's a project that I've been showing you all along that has to do with chance behavior, and I'm now trying to somewhat more organize that, and I've developed a series of ideas that takes 4 systems and can produce highly differentiated phenomena or results out of that. So these are all made out of 4 simple things. XY line, Z line, plane, and object. They're identical, so they're all brothers and sisters or cousins, right? And I'm looking at the degree of difference I can get out, and then I do a series of drawings that represent the interpretation of the model, right? That are these, and they're kind of highly detailed, so as you move into them, they're scalar. You can take a microscope and move in, and you can find more and more information, and that it's again interested in looking at new methods of organization, and I'm trying to systematize in a way the unsystematizable, let's say. And so here I am now, and I'm looking at the drawings, and they're having absolutely a literal influence on a plan I'm going to show you. And so this is I'm not sure what it is. It's not really a drawing. It's an image of something, right? That's like a drawing, let's say, that comes out of a computer, and I can now systematize that in terms of its relationship to a beginning organization of a building, and I can order it very responsibly in terms of its response to an urban environment and to nature. And so I can look at the scale here, and I can tell you that 44% of it is landscape, right? And we can discuss it in those terms. And I can now take that system of that drawing and show how it produces a highly differentiated, fairly large-scale campus. There's a research campus in Shanghai that's half a kilometer long, so it's just about city making. And then those turn into plans, right? And I can take you there. And this is all coming from that abstract drawing, right? And it's going to be very much sectional because I'm digging, and it's going to be a hybrid between landscape and building. And I'm going to be interested in something highly differentiated. So every meter will be a different section, right? And yet it'll be ordered. I'm looking for coherency, but in a much more complex term that's going to follow more of a biological model than a mechanical model. And then again, I'm looking at that constantly as a thing, right? I'm observing that three-dimensionally, and very early on, just to pursue the project in reality, I have to understand how to make it. So the structural diagrams are coming out of my studio with the use of in this case, OVERP. But we're taking responsibility for it, and it goes way back to me being in the shop. We're still in the shop, but it's in the studio. And out of it comes this, and now it's very large scale, quite complicated. And today, we're making something, this has 20-something thousand individual pieces of steel, most of them all different, irrelevant. They're cut by a computer, right? And they come out of my studio before they had to do a shop drawing. And it's again, I don't know, you might find it boring or interesting or not interesting, but it becomes today, we're, I think, moving more to the Middle Ages in terms of construction. We're building and designing. Because clients constantly say, architects draw plans, and I say, no, we don't, we build buildings, right? That's old school. Today we build. And out of that, a huge amount of the creative stuff comes out of that. And again, within this language, we're now technically resolving the construction of these things that started as drawings, and it's going to get us this. Everything is building. Everything under the grain, theaters, meeting spaces, libraries, making public space, a complete ambiguity between inside and outside, which of course is part of the tradition I bring from Los Angeles with Neutra and Schindler, and something that's absolutely kind of standard. And an enormous differentiation that you constantly find new representations of a single system. Well, the system that represents the connection of multiple systems. Crossing a boulevard to the other side of the boulevard for the campus. The connective tissue that makes that happen. The movement part of that. Part of an entrance sequence to a guest quarters. Part of the eating facility and cafeteria. The headquarters, the main meeting space. Again, everything connected to site. So you're always aware of the relationship of the landscape and water. And yeah, you like the rowing? You know I shop that in, don't you? They don't row in China. You got it. Nobody gets that one. I'm always kind of curious, going, what's that crew boat doing in the water? And again, I'm showing this quickly, just talking about differentiation. That this is all kind of part of a singular system. And here the Earth is literally, we're documenting the Earth as it lifts off the ground, as it detaches, right? Because we're manipulating ground. And then finally, last comment, if I knew I was doing this jury today, I would have started here, but too late. I become more and more, we've become more and more interested in urbanism over the last decade. And it started with a publication of a book we did 4 or 5 years ago, expanded that, and the commentary urbanism, that's going to talk about these ideas. And then one project took place. We won a competition for the Olympic Village in New York. And it came up today, and it would be the thing I could most clearly talk to you about, but in a very personal way. I would have given myself the same critique I gave you today 10 years ago. I would have been more in your place than I am now. And that when we did this project, we were now getting involved in my academic work at the Now Institute at UCLA in urbanism, and it became really clear to me that we were shifting more and more towards strategy, and that design was a limitation. And we were also getting critiques about the what was perceived as being over-designed in our urban work. And it was something we were constantly responding to, because I was trying to find a middle ground between architecture and planning, and the more interpretive, qualitative aspects of architecture versus the more demographic research, quantitative notions of planning. And, but the notion of the formal or the resolution of it became a huge kind of discussion that seemed we were getting from critiques. And as we started this project, we were now, and it's a housing project, and it was typical, I forgot the people in it, but it was Zaha and a typical group of people in the competition. And it's a housing project. Everybody went to work on a housing project, did studies of housing and produced housing. And we started by putting a broad envelope in the city and just looking at issues of the city and this particular site, which is on the East River across from Lower Manhattan, and a kind of a phenomenal site, and just asking questions that would relate to looking at this project urbanistically. And as we put that umbrella over it, and the umbrella was getting larger and larger in terms of its interests, we looked at cultural centers, we looked at open space, we looked at transportation, we looked at the actual venues that the Olympics were going to be at, because that was going to be important. We were the node of that in the housing. What came out of that was that this is an area that had no open space, and it needed certain type of transportation connecting to Manhattan. And then what came out of that was that actually became a much more interesting project than the housing. And the housing was just kind of stuff that had to be accommodated, but the housing needed an idea. Housing isn't an idea, it's just a simple functional criterion. And what came out of that is that the most interesting project was the potential of a large park. And then we studied all of the parks and the boroughs, and we found out that this would be the third largest park, and it was an area completely empty of open space, right? And it's Queens in terms of a borough. And we pursued it as a open space, and we won the competition. In a lot of competitions today, you have mid-reviews. And in the mid-reviews, I remember asking, is anybody else in this direction? And they said no, and I remember coming back and saying, okay, go to work, it's ours, wrap it up, we've got it done. And when we won the competition, and the mayor, it was Bloomberg at the time, when he announced it, he never even talked about housing. He said the legacy of this project will be the third largest park in New York, and it completely changed the firm. This was a mark in our firm, that after this, we can't work on projects without understanding them in broader macro terms. And I think what it does, and again, it'd be for the conversation I had today, you realize the limitations of being an architect to solving the problem, right? That it's actually, it's just about a negative, because you come in with too many a priori notions in terms of the importance of architecture. And I think what you have to do is broaden your thinking, right? To look at projects that start with broad infrastructural, social, cultural, et cetera, to locate architecture's problem. And at that level, it changed our studios, and that we now start the first semester with problem formation. We don't touch anything having to do with solution. What is the problem? And for me, it's more and more important for young architects to be able to take more responsibility for the actual formation of the problem and not turn that over to somebody else, right? And to be responsible for that. And then after that came immediately in our competitions, a competition in China of an island. And now we're looking at this thing and we're only talking about it in terms of environment, social behavior, infrastructure. And each one, we, like the New York one, like we did a street pattern, but we did it in a way we said, well, it's 30% more efficient than a normative one, and it's worth, and we took responsibility, it's worth $500 million, and that $500 million will build a park. And each one we talked about in economic terms and in very specific terms to be able to discuss to the city kind of why should we win this. And then just recently we won, not moving, it's supposed to move. I think this is on the piece. We won a competition in China for quite a large, actually kind of the scale of what you guys are doing, not quite as big, maybe 15 million meters. And it's going to represent the result of everything I've talked about, having to do with looking at both the relationship of using site and earth and landscape as part of the project, essential to that, and to be able to study something that has the diversity, the complexity, the differentiation of a found city developed over centuries. Thank you so much.
you have to take it.
Yeah, okay, okay,
Así que
okay.
nos pedimos disculpas, no podemos tener tiempo para preguntas y respuestas. No, simplemente tenemos que cortarlo aquí porque tiene que coger un avión y estar a las 8 en Nueva York. Así que os pedimos disculpas, lo dejamos aquí. Muchas gracias, Thom.
Thank you. Thanks.
Incredible.
What?
Incredible, amazing.
Is that good?
Absolutely.
Good.